Today I'm speaking with Daranté Lamar. Daranté, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Thank
It's
you for having me.
absolutely it's a privilege and honor to speak with you. And just to give a quick bio, Daranté lives in Dothan, Alabama, not too far from me. I'm over here in Atlanta, Georgia. He is married to Darnea. And do you have children, by the way?
Four children.
Wow, what ages
12 to
approximately?
16.
12
12
to
to
6.
16. Yep.
Wow, so you had them all like bang, bang, bang.
Pretty much.
And wow, so you're like, it's all about to be about driving cars here. Wow, that's crazy.
Driving and getting ready for college. Yes.
Mm, amazing. Durante is a project manager in the healthcare field. He's also a chancellor at a nonprofit that his family created called Together We Can. It cultivates a global hub of authentic leadership for the purpose of creating a better world for future generations. And I'll ask you in a minute to tell us more about that. He's also a fellow YouTuber. I'll have the links beneath this video. Please go like and subscribe. And he's also an author. The books I know about so far are Insignificant. That's not my description, that's the title. His first book is Insignificant, but it is significant. Uh, the next book is called Memphis, The Last Supper, and Parenting on Purpose. Besides that, what I know about you, tell us more about yourself.
Absolutely. Born and raised, of course, in Dothan, Alabama. Had the opportunity to live in DC for a while as a young person, and I speak fast, so tell me to slow down anytime you need to. But I am a I often describe myself as too big for the box because I have so many different things that I gravitate towards. So I'm a singer, I'm a musician, I'm an author, I'm an artist, I'm a computer programmer, I'm a project manager. Ever since kind of leaving the faith, I've just been challenging myself to figure out all the things that I could do to really discover my capacity and pushing myself to the limits. And it has been an incredible journey.
Mm,
I've enjoyed it.
that's awesome. And you're working on some more books, is that right?
Yes, I am. I'm working on two books right now. One is called Christ Held Up, and it's basically just dealing with the second coming and hey, what's the deal with the long delay? And the second one is called The Case for Religion, where I'm kind of building off of the work of sociologist Emil Durkheim, who's kind of like the father of sociology, but he did early work on religion and kind of showing how religion stems from a very early or primitive form of humanism. And so in that book, I'll kind of be walking through those processes, showing that there were some very appropriate reasons that we had these beliefs at one time, but how over time we've not evolved ourselves appropriately. So often describe myself as anti-superstitious, not necessarily anti-religion. I am
Mm,
okay with religion as long as it doesn't have superstition,
yeah.
which is a hard thing to do in today's climate, but I don't think that's necessarily odd. I think that is a part of our kind of evolutionary journey. Again, there was a time in life where some of these things were appropriate to think. You didn't know any better. We didn't have all of the information, and I do mean like a long time ago. But it's now definitely high time for us to move past from that and really kind of separate these things and separate ourselves from superstition altogether and see if there's any redeeming quality in religion.
Mm,
In that book, I'm not making the necessarily the case for religion. I'm researching the case for religion. I'm just as curious as everybody else.
yeah, that's interesting. It does seem like even with the basic concept too of the opiate of the masses, like there is a sense in which I've asked the question: are there certain people? I know I'm jumping ahead here, but just real quick.
Oh, this is good.
I'm the question of are there certain people who are just not ready to be unplugged,
Right.
and like they're truly not ready. Like if they learn enough of where the mythology came from, they will truly become suicidal. It's
Yeah.
just, or they'll just be so depressed because of nihilism or whatever that they won't want to get out of bed in the morning. Like, are there certain people from? It's just not like don't go there. And
Yeah.
certainly that thing you could argue that for people who are like in the last few years of their life, like if they've dedicated their whole life to Christ, at that point,
Yes.
just be happy in your last few years. But for the people that are in an earlier part of life, like are there people for whom it's just too much? The terror theory of I've wasted 40 years of my life and I may not see
Ooh,
people in the afterlife, and it's just too much. And I do question that, but at the same point, I know that for the sake of future generations, it's
yes.
important that this still we have to change this culture. But anyway, probably jumping ahead
Absolutely.
there.
Nope. I love it. I love it.
Awesome. Well, before we get started, could you think of something completely quirky or fun or a hobby or anything that's just out of the blue or out of the ordinary?
I think the probably the weirdest thing about me that's quirky is that there's this little PlayStation 5 game called Ancestors, and I love it. It's a game about these basically about the evolution of the human species, and it's kind of open world, but you have to figure out how to evolve throughout the game.
Nice.
And yeah, it's so incredible. But the weird thing that I do is, I guess being the Homo sapien that I am, I'm just trying to claim the whole map. So it's not a part of the actual gameplay, but I'm building stuff all over the map just to be able to say Daranté was here. That is, I don't know if that's controlling, if that's my inner God, to
Hmm.
me trying to say this is my world, but that's, you don't want to play games with me. I take games away from what they're supposed to be and find my own little thing to do in them. But that is definitely a little quirky thing about me.
Nice. It's funny you mentioned that because it makes me think too of your book that you're researching and how like the whole idea of we have evolved, and
Yes.
it's amazing how much when you really sit back and think about that, how so much of what we've been seeing in religion and culture and politics and everything is indeed an evolution, and it's also very much a survival of the fittest, not just in the sense of biologically, but in the
Yeah.
sense of which message, which messengers are shouting the loudest and which
Yes.
messengers can survive the onslaught of the anti-messenger. And very much like we're in a culture where that is very much about the evolution of an idea, the idea,
Yes.
like you said, about superstition. And it sounds like I'm seeing a theme there, but I'm sure we'll get
Yes.
into that more soon. Well, I do love to give people the floor to tell us, where they're coming from worldview wise. If you could take us back to the earliest days, how did you first hear about the Bible and Jesus, and how did that story evolve?
Absolutely. It has been very interesting because I've had a lot of times to talk about this over the past few weeks, and it's been therapeutic and triggering and jarring all at the same time. Because some of these things I had, not thought about in years. Specifically my early days. And it amazed me. I was telling my wife, like, I cannot believe I had not thought about this stuff because much of it was very traumatizing in the beginning. But I grew up with a typical 80s household in the South, impacted by the crack epidemic, um, dysfunctional type of family. And it's a family that I would describe as culturally Christian, which means there was a Bible in the house. We did not read it. When maybe my mom or one of my aunts or my grandmother was going through a hard time, maybe they'd open up a scripture and read something to try to make themselves feel better. But it was never the subject of conversation in the house or anything like that. We had a Bible, but we did not live like Christians. We went to church every now and then, and of course these were my very young years. So at the time, I was completely bored out of my mind. Part of my family was Baptist, the other half was African Methodist Episcopal. In both churches, and I'm not saying it about the denominations, but both of those particular churches were boring. I remember as a child, I would just lean my head back and count the tiles and the ceilings. I honestly at that time I just figured this is something that adults do. This is nothing different than court, or going to get your license or something, just something weird that adults do for weird reasons that adults do it. And then of course, growing up, I got in trouble in school a lot. I don't know if you can tell, but I kind of talk a lot, and I do have a deep voice, so my voice carries. So I would always get called out in class, and back in those days, they'd make you write things on the board. I will not talk in class, 100 times or whatnot. And I didn't learn. I'd keep talking in class because people were talking to me, so I didn't want to be rude. And so I kept getting in trouble. And one of my aunts decided, well, your punishment is going to be that you're going to read the Bible. And so she made me read the book of
Nice.
Genesis. Yeah, right. She made me read the book of Genesis. And I remember reading it the first time, and I was thinking, like, oh, okay, there's a talking snake here, so this can't be real. This is I by that time I was a very studious kid, so I loved to read. So I had read about dinosaurs, I'd read about Greek mythology, I'd read about Roman mythology. And so I was like, oh, this is more mythology. All right, cool. Um, and so I didn't have a special attachment with it from reading it. And I had a bunch of questions for her after reading it. And so she figured that I was just kind of being a smart aleck type of thing. And she said, well, now you got to write it. So I had to go back and write the book of Genesis. And I
Oh
was a
wow.
smart, yeah, I was a smart kid though, or at least I thought I was. So I would just skip words every now and then. I'd skip a pronoun here and there just to make my work a little shorter. But I did learn immensely a lot about the Bible at that time, and none of it made me want to be a Christian. I was one of the very few people who did not come to Christianity. I don't want to say few people, but I didn't come to Christianity because I read something in the Bible that made me, as a child, say, "Oh, this God is very loving and very good." You don't get that from Genesis, to be sure. But my mom, who was struggling with drug addiction at the time, she started going to a Pentecostal holiness church. And I went to that church, and I remember them praying for my mom, and she started crying, and she started, like gyrating and stuff, and they were like, "We're
Oh wow.
casting the devils out of her." And I was like, "Oh yes, somebody's fixing my mom," you know? And so for the first time, something that I had not seen in any of the other churches that I experienced, and something that I didn't see in the Bible per se at that time, not from Genesis and Exodus for sure, was this active God who was actually concerned about people individually. And so I got that introduction there, and I remember, oh, my mom's crying, she's going to be better. And so I got really interested in church at that moment. It became very interesting. And I saw other young kids in church. They were playing instruments, and they looked like they loved Jesus. And I'm like, okay, maybe there's something I've been missing, and maybe my life has been so traumatic because my mom didn't know Jesus and my dad didn't know Jesus, and so we weren't living the way we were supposed to live as a family. And so I got interested in this God. I didn't get saved immediately, but I did get interested, and I wanted to know more, especially because this God was able to move people. This God was able to make people run around the church. This God was able to he gave the preacher this power where when the preacher would touch people, they would fall out, and then the preacher could tell people things, and those people would be like, "Oh, you're telling me the truth. This is about my life." And I was like, okay, this must be evidence of something. I don't understand it. I don't get it. But as this little 10, 11-year-old kid, I'm watching it and I'm like, okay, I'm interested. And I started thinking about it for a while. And then I decided, because, they do the little altar calls. And every time they do the altar call, as a kid at this time, you'd always look around and see who else was going to answer the call first. And then I was like, maybe this is my day. Maybe this is my time. And so I went down, and the preacher prayed for me. And I'll admit, coming in, I didn't know what to expect because church did not look like the Bible that I read. And so and the only thing that did at that time made me sure that I was missing something about the Bible. There's something here that I'm not seeing. So, but I went down, and they led me through the Lord's Prayer. And at that time, if you would have asked me, I would have described, oh, feeling a presence, feeling something come over me, and then everybody's praying over me, and then they're super happy that I'm excited. And then other kids came down after I came down. And then that reinforced within me that I must really did the right thing. And God wanted me to do it at this exact time to lead those other people down here too, even though those other people had been down millions of times, exaggerating, obviously. But I could tune all that out, and it was just like, nope, this is a divine moment for the first time. I think I'm coming in contact with this divine creator that
Hmm.
I've not known.
Can I ask
Um,
just a clarifying question? Were they
yes,
in the Lord's Prayer is obviously an evangelical sense of
yes.
the desire to be right with God, but were they telling you already messages such as you're a sinner, you deserve hell, and Jesus died for your sins? Was that already kind of in your mind, at least as an option?
That is a great question, and no, they
Hmm.
were not. I didn't come across that until a little later. At that time, it was just God is a loving father, and he wants to love you, and he wants to be there for you, and he wants to protect you. And as a little kid who grew up without a father, I'm like, yes, I've hit the jackpot. This is the moment. And then
Hmm.
experiencing what I would have described as their love at that time, because they're also happy for me. They were also happy that I came down there. Some of them were more emotional than I was. And I was like, so, it's a sociological confirmation. At the time, I would have said it was divine, but certainly now I know it's this sociological confirmation of comfort, of feeling embraced and feeling welcome. That's my story, nobody else's. It's what I needed as a little child who viewed himself as an orphan. And
Hmm.
so they led me through this prayer, and it was very simple because, to say it nice, is they weren't the smartest bulbs in the bunch. So they didn't really have a determined theology, and you find that a lot among the smaller churches. This is somebody who just had a burning inside of them one day and went out and said, the Lord called me to preach, but they don't even necessarily have a sound theological foundation, which I found out very quickly. But they just
Hmm.
said, all you have to do is ask the Lord into your heart. And I was like, that's it? And it was like, yes, just ask the Lord into your heart. And so I did that. Everybody's crying. And then he said, okay, but now you got to get filled with the Holy Spirit too, with the evidence of speaking in tongues. And I was like, well, I had heard people speak in tongues. And so I was like, sure, I want that. That seems kind of cool? And they're like, yeah, because this is your language that you pray to God in. And like, if I can go back, I'd be like, but why doesn't God understand English? But anyway, that's a whole nother thought. But,
Just to comment real quick on what you said about the way that they were kind of keeping it simple, it's amazing to me that I think can be used by a lot of churches and probably is to really hook kids while they're still in that earlier phase. Because
yes,
if you like, I remember this one church I heard they were doing like a VBS, and they weren't even using the word savior or sin. They were just saying to the kids, Jesus wants to be your special friend,
yep,
and it's as simple as that.
yep,
Nothing more deep or profound or frightening. And so when you get that sense of like we all know we need help. We all know we
yep,
get scared. We all know we need something to get us through on the hard days. And Jesus wants to be there for you. Well, who doesn't want that?
yep.
But then if you were to introduce them at that time to the full picture of, but by the way, if you don't accept this guy's love, he's going to beat the shit out of you in the afterlife. It's like you don't tell him that. You tell him that later when you get into theology of like, okay, what does sin really deserve, and what
Yes.
was Jesus actually saving us from? But it's fascinating to me how so many groups do that, and I think for a lot of people, that's one of the reasons that they stay so long
Oh
is
yeah.
because they don't see that there's more to it than simply I need a good father, like you talked about. I need a good
Mhm.
father, and God, you're it.
Right.
I'm in need, and you're my helper. I'm in trouble, and I need a rescuer. Everything is just love and sunshine and puppy dogs, and it's like at a certain point you have to admit what's in this text, and it's
Yes.
not as simple as God is just love.
No.
And it's amazing to me though how I've seen that so prevalently, and I think it disturbs me though because you see a lot of people going into like leaving conservative Christianity when they realize it's that bad. They go into a
Yeah.
liberal version, progressive version, but at that point they just have to chop the hell out of their text. To, like, I like this passage, but not the next 10. So I'm going to take the
Yes.
loving passage, and the next 10 are just kind of they're obviously outdated or something. But you go that route, and eventually you've got very little left of the Bible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And interestingly enough, that does kind of end up being the my route. I often explain to people I think I was deconstructing the whole time.
Hmm.
Because I was never it's not that I wasn't sold, and I want to be careful with saying that. I was sold, I just wasn't convinced. And in my mind, I reckon that I wasn't convinced because I don't know enough. I wasn't convinced because I'm a novice. I'm still a babe in Christ. And so, but I was willing to justify God by my faith. I'm going to have faith in you. If I don't see you, it's me. That's the problem, not you. If I don't hear you, it's me. That's the problem. And that's what ultimately led me to the sin conscious aspect of it. In the
Hmm.
beginning, it was just happy to have a father, and we'll see where this goes. So the night I get saved, I go home to my mom's house, which we lived in a little apartment complex at the time. She gave me some money and asked me to go up the road and just buy her some liquor from the bootlegger, which was very common in Alabama. And I had done it plenty of times before with no problem. But that night, I felt like I had the Holy Spirit convicting me. And
Hmm.
so I remember walking to the bootlegger's house, and then there was another lady who went to the same church that lived in the same neighborhood. So I stopped at her house first, and I said, "Hey, I'm supposed to be going to do this for my mom, but I feel like God doesn't want me to do this." And she says, "Well, that's the Spirit of God speaking to you." And just thinking about that now, this is the first time in my life where made the Spirit of God equivalent with my own inner voice. Because I told her, I think I'm supposed to do this. And then her response was immediately, "That's the Lord." And that literally became how most of my conversations went with people. I said, "I think," and then someone says, "That's the Lord." And so eventually, after a while of hearing that so often, I stopped saying, "I think," and I start saying, "The Lord said," the Lord is leading.
Hmm.
Um, so she told me, "Hey, that's the Lord. Go home and let your mom know." So I went home, told my mom, "Hey, mom, I can't do it. I don't believe God wants me to do this." And she was like, "Okay." And then I woke up the next morning and she packed all my bags and said, "You can get out. You will either serve me or you will serve the church." Which brings me to one of my first caveats
Wow.
for anyone to ever say that I was never a Christian. Number one, I halfway take that as a compliment. And so I'll just put that out there. But number two, I chose the church over my mother. And what people don't understand, and that's a child. I was 11, 12 years old by that time. That's a child, 10, 11, child. But I chose the church over my mother because I got into this because I believe God could save my mother. You know,
Mm.
that's what I believe. God can save anybody. He can save my mother. That's why it took me a little longer to get to the sin part, because I didn't necessarily come to Jesus for me. I love the father aspect, but it was this father who loves me enough to fix my mom. I think at that time I wasn't yet old enough to know that there was stuff wrong with me. I'm still a kid. What could be wrong with me? But the church soon started to tell me what was wrong with me. I found out very quickly within the next few weeks. Well, you got to cut your hair. You have long hair. God doesn't like long hair. And this is the first bit of contention that I started having with church folks, because I'm just a young person trying to ask, and I haven't yet been told that you're not supposed to question us. And so I have the questions. And so they say, well, God doesn't like long hair. And I say, but Samson has long hair. That's a part of the Nazarite vow. And then it's like, well, how do you know that? And it's like, well, I've been reading the book. I do know a little something. At the time, John the Baptist, I remember saying that his hair was described as wild and unruly, even. And then, of course, every picture we have of Jesus, there's not one with a buzz cut. Every single one of them, it's long hair. So there was
Mm.
contention there, and I got called rebellious and stuff. But I was really just trying to learn. I was trying to understand. The church I went to, the women couldn't wear pants, and they had scripture for it. Men ought not to wear what women wear. And I was like, but these clothes come from the women's section. So I don't understand how that's even relevant. And then I said, again, I grew up reading about Greek mythology and things of like that. So I'm like, based off of my understanding, people during this time frame wouldn't have wore pants anyway. They would have all been wearing dresses, togas, but dresses nonetheless. So
Yeah.
I, I couldn't understand these little nitpicky things about God. And that created a lot of problems for me in that Pentecostal holiness church. They eventually kicked me out.
Mm. Because you're just
I
asking so many questions.
Too many questions. One lady actually said, because they used to play the little Bible games at church, and I played one week and I lost every question. I didn't know anything. And then the next week I won every question, and she said, "You're possessed by the spirit of Beelzebub, because there's no way you could have learned all of that in that short a time."
Wow.
My experience with
As
that
opposed to
church,
just you're a smart guy.
just well, what I did realize about not just this particular church, but quite a few churches in my context, is that they weren't necessarily being anti me, they were being anti intelligence. And the preacher often preached against intelligence. He often preached against seminary, often preached against learning anything. Of course, facts don't mean anything. And so, me asking questions for them and their worldview was, this is the work of the devil. Only the devil would ask these questions, such as, hath God said,
Mm.
that you should not eat of this tree.
I think that's
And
one of the
so
scariest mentalities I've come across a little bit. It's one of the scariest things I've seen, especially when they're not just doing it as adults, but then insisting on passing that mentality to kids. It's crazy.
it's frightening. It's definitely one of my biggest regrets. I lived at least 30 years of my life as half a person, and that does not feel good.
Mm.
I lived at least 30 years of my life questioning myself at every turn, not trusting myself, believing that anything I said to myself was the devil, believing that any conversation in my head that did not align, not just it, and it, that's I think that's the complexity that people often don't address as a Christian. It's not just not living my life in a way that doesn't align with the Bible. It's also that doesn't align with whoever's branch of theology is judging me at that time. Because what you end up with is, and this, from what I haven't found two Christians who believe the exact same thing. I've never been in a room where you can get two believers together and you walk them through and you say, oh, we believe these exact same things. There's that much of a complexity to it because there is no amount of certainty or surety in any of it. So we all just kind of get to pick and choose. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
not only are people divergently convinced of different things, but they're ready to start swinging if you disagree with them, or at least start calling you a really ignorant person, or the snark of like, I guess you haven't done enough study yet, and
Yep.
or even like you said, Beelzebub. There's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with you that you can't. If you're in the Word of God, you would see it my way. It's crazy. I'm in a lot of Bible groups myself on Facebook, just like
Yeah.
a fly on the wall. And it's amazing how many of those people are they're ready to fight each other, and they all love the Lord, they love the
Yep.
gospel, they love heaven, but they're ready to call each other idiots all day long. It's crazy.
All day long. I mean, but honestly, that's been the history of Christianity. There has not been a point in in Christianity's existence where it has not been a divided religion. And I don't have to make anything up for that. It's even in Scripture. By the time Paul is writing, he's already saying, some are saying I'm of Paul, some are saying I'm of Apollos. This has been a group of different factions since the very beginning, and even now we have over 45,000 different Christian denominations, because we can't agree. But yet we're telling other people that no, it's all clear. It's all clear. It's so clear that we have 45,000 different denominations. And then even among those denominations, we still have separation. So even amongst the Baptists, you have the Free Will Baptist, the National Baptist, the Southern Baptist, the Fundamental Baptist, the Full Gospel Baptist, which is the one that came out in the 80s. They were the Baptists who speak in tongues. And so you have all of these things because it isn't clear. And I think if we could all if we can get Christians to admit that, that would be one step in the right direction right there.
And
That
isn't
that is
that verse too where Jesus prays that we'd all be one?
right. That's at one point I would have said that's the whole point of Scripture, is that we all be one. Now I'd say that was wishful thinking on my part, thinking that was the whole point of Scripture. That, and again, that's going back to kind of like what you were saying, how some people do go through this part where you're just picking parts out of the Bible, and after a while, there's nothing left. And by the end of my ministry as a pastor, that's where I was. I realized I was at this place that I don't believe in much of the stuff that's in here, and yet I'm still doing this role. I'm still doing this. I can't do it anymore.
Mm.
But it
So
took me a long while to get there.
can I ask that, just to clarify, when you were at that crossroads with your mom, saying, serve me or serve the church, how did that conversation play out? And like, did it go back and forth at all where it's like, well, mom, I love you, I want to leave you, but like, was it just an immediate parting of ways?
It was an immediate parting of ways. She said it. In my mind, I thought that's the devil. For
Wow.
for you to even give me such an ultimatum, for you to ask me to choose between you and God's bride, that has to be the devil. And so for me and my 11, 12-year old self-righteousness at that time, I choose the church, Mom.
Mm. Where did you go?
Well, I walked about 3 hours to one of the ministers who went to the church, who was a minister at that church. I walked to his house. He kept foster kids and stuff like that. He had two in his house at the time, plus his own children, and I was very close with his children. So I walked to his house, told him what happened, and he told me to trust God, but that he had no place for me to stay. So
Mm.
just walked around and found somewhere to sleep until one of my cousins found out that, oh, Daranté's out there sleeping on the streets, and lived with my cousin for a while, and then my dad found out, and so for the first time in my life, I went to live with my dad.
Mm.
Yeah, that was a
What
whole
a
other situation.
crazy ride.
And through all of that, I didn't lose my faith, my new emerging faith. Now, you would have think that at that moment I'd definitely been like one of the seeds to the waysides, that just the cares of life would have came and choked me out for sure. But in my mind, I had married this idea so much that I felt that this must mean I'm special. That's where my mind went. If this happens the day I get saved, then God must really have something big for me.
Oh yeah.
And that became my livelihood. So by the time I moved with my dad, he thought I was absolutely weird, like batshit crazy, because I prayed all day. I'd read my Bible all day. I'd take my Bible to school. He used to tell me, "You can't do that. That's illegal." And I'm like, "I don't think so." And so I'd take my Bible to school, and I'd minister to other kids, because I wanted them to know the God that I was getting to know, and that if this God thought that I was special, that surely he would think that they were special too. And those early days, I could kind of see it as a really high naivety, because I was very charismatic. Again, Pentecostal holiness come out of that. And at the time, I was definitely taking in a lot of TBN, lots and lots and lots of TBN. So there was the Bishop Jakes,
Mm.
the Jesse Duplantis back in those days, Clarence McClendon, a whole bunch, the whole
Mm.
gambit. And I was, man, I was a sponge. I was taking it all in, and in my worldview, describing it looking back, it was like I believe God wanted to give us all superpowers. And so I wanted to help everybody find their superpower. God wants to give you a superpower. He either wants to make you an apostle, a prophet, an evangelist, a pastor, or a teacher, and he wants to use you to win the nations. And you don't have to wait until you're 30 or 40 to be used for God. We can be used right now. As a matter of fact, I don't even trust those 30 and 40-year-olds after what I've seen. And
Mm.
so, and it was amazing. During those times, as a Christian, it was amazing because every school I've been a part of after I got saved, I started a campus ministry. If there was already one there, I became a part of it, and most times, typically found out I didn't like it, typically because of the treatment of other people, and so wanted to create something that was a little more inclusive while still pushing Jesus, and we did, and we saved saved so many lives. There are
Did you say
people.
saved or screwed?
Oh man. Well, and now looking at some of them, I'm like, oh, I wish I would have never did that to you.
Yeah,
I
I
wish I
said
would
the
have
same
never
thing
led you that
myself.
path. It was rough. And I was rough. I was a handful because I was becoming more and more inculcated in this idea that I was special. I was coming more inculcated in this idea that God was choosing me and that God was using me. Um, which
Mm.
made me very, very self-righteous. So I had a band in high school, Christian band. If you smoked, you could not be in my band. If you cussed, you could not be in my band. If you wrote love letters that had sexually explicit material in them, you could not be in my band. And if you didn't pray 3 hours a day, you could not be in my band. Because I'm thinking, surely me, if I'm praying 3 hours a day, you can too. And God is so good to us. He gives us 24 hours a day. Surely we can give him three, which is just a little bit more than 10%. And I and I and
Mm.
and throughout high school, I used to teach that you should tithe your day to God, that you should spend that time with him. And by the way, I'm teaching all of this on faith because I'm doing the same things and I'm not feeling anything. This is the trauma that I would do my best to kind of knock out of my head and try to say, no, that was just the devil. But I remember, like, there's too many nights to number of how many nights I sat on my floor, laying prostrate before the Lord, saying, God, I'm going to keep doing this, but if you would just speak to me to let me know that I am doing the right thing, because I'm not sure all the time. If you would just speak to me and let me know that my mom is going to end up coming back to you, or you just speak to me and tell me what the hell you want from me, because I'm getting confused and I don't know if I'm just doing all of these things or if I'm actually being led by you. So if you could just tell me, I won't tell anybody. Just tell me, whisper to me, do something. And it never happened. And I would spend several nights just crying. I remember one time at the altar when I was a youth minister at the altar, I prayed so hard my nose started bleeding.
Oh.
And the sickness of my mind at the time is I took that as a sign from God. I took
Mm.
it as a sign from God that God is making my nose bleed, so he's answering my prayer.
Mm.
And it's like, out of all the things that an all powerful God could do to answer prayer, a nosebleed. But that's how
Wow.
desperate I was to believe that I'm, and that's where I'll take it off of a little bit of the religious folk. That was a part of my own problem. That's how desperate it was for me to feel like I was relevant. That's how desperate I was to feel like somebody loved me. To me, it wasn't even just about the theological God. I was already sure that most people had their theology wrong by the time I was 13. I
Mm.
was already absolutely positive. At 14, I was sitting in a room with some older bishops, and I remember them arguing about whether God is a trinity, a triune God, or just one God. And I kept trying to ask them, what scriptures are you pulling these differences from? Because I don't see these arguments that any of you are making. And for me at the time, I would see stuff because Jesus said stuff to his disciples when they would come to him complaining about other people doing stuff. He'd say, hey, like, if they're not against us, then don't even worry about it. And I never saw that behavior in church. I never saw that type of mentality. These guys who literally serve the same Lord and Savior are fighting over whether he's three in one, one in three, or one all by himself. And I'm like, I couldn't even understand why it was important. So by the time I was 13, 14, I was I was already sure that most adults had already missed the point, and I was the advocate that we were the Joshua generation. and that we were going to seek his face and get the truth, and then we were going to give that to the world. Again, this is because I had been inculcating myself in this idea that I'm special. I'm a prophet to the nations. I'm an apostle of faith. I am here to set things straight. At 17 years old, I was preaching in small churches and telling people that the glory of the Lord was not in this church. You need to close your doors. God is not pleased. I was an arrogant somebody.
Hmm.
And
Can I
and
just
and
mention real quick?
yes,
I can definitely relate to the concept you're painting too of wanting to be really special and powerful. I remember a lot of kind of tongue in cheek but very serious messages of like when you wake up in the morning, when you put your feet on the ground, the devil should be like, uh-oh, he's awake again, like
yes,
he's going to do something.
hmm
But I was under the teaching from afar from a pastor named John MacArthur. Have you ever heard of him
absolutely,
out in California?
absolutely,
I
yes,
listened to him for years, and he had the same message of like all these other churches are so wrong, but I've got the pure message, and that got in my head too. But I remember as well him talking at one point about his story, and he was saying when he first started his church, he used to pray to God, God, please, whatever I can do for the kingdom, I want to do it. But also, I don't want to be just another pastor. I want this to be an absolute like shockwave through the spiritual kingdom. I want to be
yes,
not just one pastor, but a very different pastor. And you can look at the time, it was like, okay, yeah, that's important. We
that's
shouldn't just want a paycheck and a
hmm
job. We should be wanting to be world changers and kingdom changers. But looking back on it from this vantage point, it's like you were arrogant, like crazy. Like why
absolutely,
is this? Why has this ever been about you? Why, if it's all about Jesus, who cares whether you're a big shot or not? Who cares?
yes,
It's all about Jesus's glory, God's glory. But then also you realize, as so many of us are talking about, this is a drug. You get like
yes,
the drug of like I am doing something special. I've got a special. Excuse me if I can speak right. I've got a special message that you all need to hear, and either
yes,
you haven't heard it, and that's why it's important, or you haven't had the ears to hear, and I can give it to you in a way that will make it palatable. But there's something about me and my
hmm
maybe my generation, but for sure about me that has such a new insight and a way of delivering it that I'm special.
yep,
And you do it at a certain point between the humility of just saying, like God, I just want you to use me, but also
yeah,
the arrogance of saying, I want to be used mightily. I want to be a
absolutely,
king. I want to be a David. I don't want to be just anybody. I want to knock down giants. I want to knock
yeah,
down Goliath. And you say that to yourself enough times, and you may not see it in yourself, but it's like this is an arrogance issue. You
yep,
you want to be really much bigger than your britches. And and when you see some people hitting those marks, you're like, oh, that guy, he's now the pastor of a church of 1,000 people.
yes,
I could have a church of 50, or I could have a church of 1,000. Where
yeah,
you see some, guy that's only 18 to 20 years old, and he's doing these seminars every city, every 2 days, talking about purity culture or something. It's like, wow, he's writing books at 18. Maybe I need to step up to the plate and be in those.
yes,
And you end up seeing these icons, and you're just like, I see the path, and the path
yep,
is glorious, not just to God, but it's to me.
to me,
I will make
yes.
a name for God, but I'll also make a name for myself. Don't tell anybody. And you end up really just exposing the fact that this is not a spiritual issue. This is a very humanistic
Very
arrogance
human.
issue.
Yep.
It's crazy how it works.
It was very easy to turn my self-aggrandizement into honor. This is
Yes.
honor. This is God is going to use me more because I'm going to give more of myself to God than anybody else. And just think of the huge arrogance in that, because it's assuming that I know what anybody else is giving to God. It's assuming that I know anything about anybody else's walk. But back then, you wouldn't have been able to tell me that. I remember the first time I laid hands on somebody and they fell out. The feeling I got from that, just, just and the lady, she's, and it's like I did that.
She fell backwards.
Yes, she fell backwards, and they called her. Of course, she was a big
Right.
one. They called her and laid down, and then I went to the next one, and then I was like, holy snap! That power
Wow.
that I wanted when I was a kid. He's finally given it to me. He's finally pleased.
At that point,
He,
you're a wizard. You're a magic wizard.
yes, I am. Oh, you couldn't tell me nothing. And I tried to take it very serious, but it's really hard to take those things serious in hindsight. So, like, again, very charismatic. So People are not charismatic. They may not get it, but I was so it wasn't after I saw I could lay hands. I wanted to see if I could just get multiple people at a time. So just, and then, you got several people fall out at a time. And of course, in those early years, you couldn't have told me that wasn't a supernatural event. You couldn't have convinced me that no, these are neurological responses that we're having based off of this atmosphere that has been created using music and all of these other things, and that we are a highly social species. These things are not actually as abnormal as we think they are, because these very same experiences, we have them at concerts, we have them at games, we have them everywhere. If you watch Michael Jackson concerts, you will watch people falling out in the same way. I've seen, so, but at that time, you wouldn't have been able to tell me that. At that time, God was using his special servant, his servant who had sacrificed more than the other ones, who had fasted and prayed more than the other ones, and God was showing me that he was pleased with my holiness.
Mm.
And it's the more that I wanted these type of experiences with God, what became the more that I became conscious of sin. Sin was really hard to engrave into my mindset in my younger years, because all adults were like the most horrible people ever to me. And so me seeing myself as sinful in comparison to them would have been very difficult at that time. But once I became God's vessel, purity became very important to me. And so I stopped cussing for a while. I was a smoker at hard life, so I started smoking cigarettes at 7, and so I'd been smoking cigarettes since I was 7. And then at 14, after seeing God start to kind of move through me a little bit, I decided to stop smoking cigarettes. That lasted for a good bit. And then I decided to stop cussing. I'm gonna stop messing with little girls. I'm gonna leave all of this stuff alone. It didn't exactly work out the way that I wanted it to, but I was committed to. And anytime I would do the slightest thing wrong, I would cry. I'd go to my room and I'd cry to God. And I'd say, I'm so sorry for breaking your heart. I am so sorry that I did this thing that offends you. I'm so sorry for grieving you. And then even in that, in those moments, I was more mindful of the absence of God, because my mind would give me permission to perceive the absence as judgment.
Mm.
This is God's way of saying that I'm not pleased. So at this moment, you don't even get to pretend like you feel his presence. This is a moment where you have to feel like you don't have his presence, which is, again, these things later for me became a little hard to reconcile, because I remember being around 21, 22, and begin thinking, but wait a minute, God is omnipresent. David said, if I make my bed in hell, there you are with me. So there should never be a moment that I'm not in the presence of God. But as a charismatic preacher, I preached several times, the presence of the Lord just entered the room. And then, and me, again, I felt like I was deconstructing the whole time, because I was always having these conversations, but most times I was able to kind of keep them at bay, but I still couldn't keep them away. I can keep them at bay, but they were there. Even when I was preaching, they were there. So, and people started to notice that. So even in my early years, people started to notice that, Daranté, you don't do salvation calls. And they were right. I didn't want them to bring it up. I didn't want anybody to ask me anything about it. But I did not do salvation calls, because I was having a lot of my salvation experience, as you've heard, was much different than a lot of other people. And so by this time, I'm theologically in tune to we should be leading them either through a sinner's prayer, or we should be leading them through the Romans road of salvation, or something like that. And for me, I other people were saying this is what we're supposed to do, but when I read it, I didn't see that. I was like, I'm sorry, I get how you're saying that this is supposed to be what all sinners are supposed to pray, but that's not what Paul says. He's talking to a particular audience, and I can't pretend like I don't see that. And so I don't want to trap anybody else's relationship with God to my misunderstanding or your misunderstanding. And people were very offended by me being that type of preacher, but that was just me trying to be as genuine as I could be. I didn't want to pretend. I didn't want to. I wanted God to be real. I didn't want to just be making stuff up. And so I wanted to stay as true as I could to my understanding of the text, realizing that I believe that most adults were already crazy, So,
Mm. Can I ask a clarifying question? As
yes.
you're saying, you're really getting into a deeper understanding of sin. When you did preach the message, and you did have the times when you were preaching this specific gospel for people to get saved, and then even just looking back at your own experience when you would say what your salvation was, could you just define the gospel for us? Like, what does it mean for someone, or what would you have preached in church or told someone privately if they asked, if someone said, I understand enough to know that I've got a sin problem and that God's unhappy with that, that separates me. Where do I go from here? What is the gospel at that point?
The gospel for me was definitely that there was this God, and this God was our creator, and he loved us. And we had did a lot of horrible things out of our own ingratitude and out of our own ignorance, and that we were born into this. We didn't necessarily ask for it, but this is the world that we're born into. And God loves us so much that he decided to give us a way of escape. Even after we messed everything up, he had given us this perfect world. And then we messed it up. And then he warned us by killing us all and giving us another chance and giving us a beautiful rainbow. Okay, I'm off the gospel. Let me come back. So God loves us, right? And then in order to fix the world, when he saw that we had messed it up so bad, he sent his son and allowed his son to be condemned to die so that he could take on all of the things that we had messed up about the world. I can definitely see, just even hearing that I had definitely a more social gospel. It was that God wants to fix the world and he wants to use you to fix it. That was what I preached as the gospel. That's so for me, it didn't matter if you prayed a prayer. If you signed up in the army of the Lord, you were responding to that gospel message.
Mm.
If something I said made you say, because my version of the gospel is that Jesus was looking for workers, not worshipers. He said the Father seeketh such to worship him. He said the harvest is plentiful, the laborers are few. And so my whole ministry was about getting people mobilized to be laborers, to go out there and win others with the good news. And the good news to me was not necessarily, and I know this will give some Christians some ammo. The good news for me was not necessarily that you're a sinner saved by grace. The good news for me is that you are a sinner and God still wants to use you. That you're a sinner and God still he wants to do his great work through you. And people responded to that very well, that
Mm.
God would want to use me. And it makes sense for that to be my message because that's what brought me in.
Could I clarify
It
what the strict act of Christ dying on the cross and shedding his blood and his resurrection? What did that mean to you in terms of just in terms of your soteriology and your preaching? Did you focus on the cross much and his shed blood, and how did that weave in?
The Pentecostal experience had definitely kind of rubbed me the wrong way with the cross. We had a lot of songs. There's room at the cross for you, even now. And their obsession with the cross did kind of freak me out. But it's partly because I had other members of my family who were Jehovah's Witness, and
Wow.
Jehovah's Witnesses are not cross fans. And I've always been somewhat of an open-minded person, so I listen to other people about their things. And I think one of the comments they made when I was probably in my 13, 14 was that, why would Jesus like crosses? And I was just like, that's kind of a good point, you know. So when I did talk about the cross, it was just always about the ugliness of it, how he put himself through the worst thing that you could ever possibly imagine, and he did it all for you. With you on his mind the whole way through, they ripped his beard out. So I'd preach it for sure. I tell that story, but that story was, again, it was always about love. I did not focus on sin as much as the more I started to preach, except for as an excuse for why you didn't get what you wanted from God. Then it was, well, there's probably some sin going on here that we don't know about. But I was the loving preacher guy. I was grace, 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 and more grace, except for if you were on my team. If
Mm.
you were on my team, you got none of that grace. If you're on my team, you need to be like me. And thankfully they weren't. Uh,
Well, can I ask,
but
would you have told people when you were preaching the message that Jesus had to die,
oh
but
yes.
specifically that what was happening in that, in the sense of the activity behind the scenes? We can picture
Ooh.
the historical events if they were historical, but or at least the way we thought they were. But in terms of like what was going on in the truest reality, would you have said that God was basically taking all of his wrath that you did deserve, and he was still pouring that wrath out? He was just doing it on Christ
Absolutely.
instead. And so it was like the whole spotless lamb concept.
Absolutely.
Is that was part of it? Okay.
Absolutely. Because, without blood, without I couldn't get the word right. Without spreading the blood, there's no remission of sins. I know the
The
word isn't
shedding.
spreading. Shedding. There we go.
Shedding.
I'm like, that word. But yes, and so it was definitely, yeah, all of the ugliness of the world, though. And that was my thing. And I know it's not in line with what other Christians would have been preaching. It was, no, the world is ugly, and you're ugly because of that. And so now, and it was, I guess that was my way of kind of giving people somewhat of a cop out, maybe, is that you're not just ugly because you're just such a bad person. Even if you weren't trying to be a bad person, you would be a bad person because that's what you were born into. It's not your fault. It's just the consequences of reality. It's the
Okay.
consequences of what happened before.
What you just said made me raise alarm bells in my head for my old days. So you wouldn't have said that the people were the problem. It was that the world is full of bad, evil things, and it's just affecting us. Okay, that would be one place where we would have diverged.
Yes.
My theology would have been you are desperately wicked,
Yeah.
and that you are not, like, you're not drowning. You are the
Yeah.
corpse at the bottom of the ocean that is dead, and there was nothing you can do to earn your salvation. You are the problem. You, in a sense, killed yourself, as did the fact that you're just born a child of Adam and Eve. But that is very different. I don't know if I would have called it social gospel or not at that time when I was
Yeah.
a Christian, but just the idea of the atonement, like you are wicked.
Yeah.
Wickedness deserves punishment. The punishment that you deserve is eternal death. It
Yeah.
is the wrath of God, and therefore, like, if you had been the only person, like if you were Adam or you were Eve, and there had been no one else after you, if it
Wow.
was just if it was just you,
Yeah.
it would have been the same situation. You would have taken that bite of that fruit.
Yep.
You would have deserved it. No one else would have been to blame. There'd be no one else to look at. You were directly disobedient to God, and therefore Christ has to die in your place, regardless of what society did or did not do to you. So that's a very interesting
Yes.
divergency. But did you feel like was the atonement a critical piece to you?
It definitely was. It was, if Christ did not die on the cross, you would not. If Christ did not descend so that he could ascend, these gifts that have been made available to us would not be there. And for me, Christ's atonement work went beyond that to basically create this redemption of the believer. And that what Christ really came to do, and this was my way of reconciling my own misunderstandings, is that Christ came to die to take all that punishment, but then to also give you the tools you need to actually be able to circumvent it. So now I'm not going to leave you comfortless. I'm going to give you this comforter, and then I'm going to give you these fruit, and then I'm going to give you these gifts. And so now the work that you were incapable of doing before I came, you can now do. And I would at that time theologize that. There we go. At that time, I would theologize that by focusing on the veil being rent in the temple when Christ is crucified, and this
Mm,
being that message that you now have access. That you can now come in, you can now talk to me directly. You no longer have to depend on other people and this and that. And now, instead of there just being one main prophet or one main priest, these spiritual gifts that I've shared with special people over the years, I'm now going to share with everybody. And so now you can all be special. And this is what you need to build my church, because now my focus is the church. And if you build my church, the church will kind of save the world, which I don't think I would have said it that way at the time. It would have been Jesus saving the world, but practically we were trying to save
yeah,
the world.
basically the kingdom of Christ, but here on earth, not just in heaven.
Not
I
absolutely.
did get exposed to a little bit of that
I
theology
was
through
definitely the kingdom guy. I was the
yeah,
kingdom guy.
that message too of like the kingdom is not for the afterlife. The kingdom is not for the hereafter. The kingdom is, yes, it's there. Yes, it's more clearly there. It's more gloriously
Yes.
there, but it's also for here, starting not just in society, but even in your own heart. Like Christ is,
Yes.
you are, your heart is a kingdom, and
That's right.
let Christ be your king. For goodness sake, let him rule in you, and then eventually just kind of spreads like a virus.
Well,
But yeah,
that I mean, that's just that thing of Christ being king in you is ultimately what did finally lead to me wrestling with sin. It's that, okay, if Christ is going to fully stretch out in me, there can't be other stuff in me that Christ doesn't like. And so, and my life has to look like what Christ would want my life to look like. Otherwise, other people can easily see that Christ is not being king in my life. And so it was very important to me. I remember Jesse Duplantis one time said, embarrass sin before it embarrasses you. So when I would sin, I would go out and tell other people so that I
Mm,
could embarrass that sin before that sin had a chance to embarrass me. I, whew, again, I couldn't jail with everybody's theology, but whatever I thought would keep me in God's good graces and whatever would keep God pleased with me is what I wanted to do. I wanted to do what God wanted me to do. I'm thinking He knows better than me. I'm
mm,
just a poor little dumb somebody. I don't know anything without His Spirit. I am nothing. My flesh is evil. Everything my flesh wants is bad. So I need God's Spirit leading me, or I'm going to ruin my life.
mm.
And
Could I ask,
unfortunately,
what age did you become a pastor?
ooh, okay, let's get here. 2000.
Approximately.
Yeah, 22, 23.
Okay. And you were a
Uh-huh.
pastor for how long?
10 years.
Okay. Same
10 years.
church the whole time?
Yes. Well,
Wow.
I changed the name of it. It was Kingdom International Worship Center when I first started it. And then I realized that is an incredibly long name for a very small church. So we shortened the name to Kingdom Central. And
Okay.
I was becoming more of an urban church by that time. And so we wanted something that we were becoming a seeker friendly church at that time. That's probably the best way to say it. And
Gotcha.
Kingdom
And
Central was a better name.
just for the setting the big picture as you go into, I guess, the details of the next phase of this, but were you married when you entered the pastorate?
Ooh, okay. Yes, I was married before I became a pastor. That was a um kind of a requirement that I made of myself. It was my understanding of myself, and I used to tell people this, that if I get married, if I become a pastor and I'm not married, I'm gonna mess up. I'm gonna make things much worse than they need to be. So that was just me kind of knowing me. I don't want to be a pastor until I'm married, and so which ended up getting me to rush into my first marriage. So I've now been divorced. Yeah, we'll get there. But so yes, I was married going before I became a pastor.
Was that particular drive to get married before the pastorate more basically like purity culture? Like if I'm
Definitely.
not tempted, I'll be a better
Better to
pastor.
marry than to burn.
Yeah.
Better to
Okay.
marry than to burn. That was one of my favorite scriptures. And I didn't, it was if I have somebody in my life who's with me that I could do all those things with, then I won't have to worry about being tempted by anybody else, and everything will be great. And I didn't want to dishonor God, and so I didn't want to put myself in a situation where I felt like I would be tempted to do so and highly likely fall into it. And so marriage to me was the safest place, is to
Hmm.
make sure you're married before you do this.
It's
Which
amazing how many people's stories end up including that dynamic. Both ones that people I interview and also ones that I just listen to in other channels. But the amazing dynamics of how, like that verse you said, it's better to marry than to burn. But
yes,
then you realize if you are if you're encouraging people to get married because they're burning in passion, then you might be jumping the gun in terms of them just getting to know if we're really a good fit, especially from a secular perspective now. If the main
yes,
thing that brought you together was the question like, is this person a good person for co-ministry? If I'm
right,
gonna be a pastor, will she be a great pastor's wife or whatever?
yep,
Or even just if it's as simple as like if we're gonna have a Christian home, is this
yep,
going to be a good spouse to raise little soldiers for Jesus with? And you realize all those important questions, like just are we actually compatible on so many
yes.
levels?
Do we
You just
like
skip
each
them, and
other?
especially if your hormones are going 100 miles an hour, and you're just like, I am so ready. I'm ready yesterday to be having sex.
Yes.
I got to still wait another 3 months. Are you kidding me? And it's
Right?
like, that you get people in that frame of mind, and not only do they often mess up, in quotes before they
Yeah.
get married and feel guilty about it, and then bring that guilt into their marriage, but
Yes.
also regardless of that, you end up completely circumventing the chance to just truly get to know each other and see if you're a
Yeah.
good fit. And so many people I've heard these horrible stories. I mean, honestly, my own included, where
Yeah.
you end up making decisions based on this Christian worldview, and you aren't actually aware of the most important questions regarding compatibility. And if your biggest thing is I got to get married so I don't keep lusting after all these other people, like that's not the right reason to get married. It's
Oh
just not.
no. Well, and I think the statistics will bear that out now. I think statistics bear that out pretty well.
Yeah, for sure. So you're how long were you married the first time?
8 years.
Okay.
8 years.
And was
And
that was the breakdown of that marriage up
my
did
deconversion.
your ministry have a problem with that?
Well, I left the ministry and the marriage at the same time.
Okay.
It was when I was finally sure that I don't believe this anymore and that I can't in good conscience continue to believe this.
Okay.
That I did start having conversations with my then wife, and she was not happy. And she, of course, she just figured it's the devil. The devil is trying to get you, you know.
Mm,
And I told her, and I pulled a few of my staff together from the church, and I said, well, listen, while I'm going through this, I can't be your pastor. I don't qualify to be anybody's pastor right now. I'm going through both a divorce and I don't believe this anymore. And before you try to convince me anything otherwise, I have to be honest with you and let you know that I haven't believed this for a while. I know I'm really good at preaching. This is I'm also I'm an artistic person, so performance I'm very good at, and I'm very passionate about people. So I get that I'm good at this, but for the past few years, I've not believed this, and
mm,
honestly, it's broken my heart to even get up here and say these things because I'm not seeing it actually help anybody. And for me, it was a very crucial period in my life because, as I've mentioned before on another podcast, this was around when Trayvon Martin was shot and Mike Brown was shot. So I was wrestling with a lot of things at that time and watching some of my colleagues in ministry commercialize this moment with no intentions of putting any action into it. And I wanted to be very mad at them at that time and I was angry. I was very angry. But then I realized that I had been blind to that type of behavior the whole time, that this wasn't new. It was just, this one just touched my heart differently. But we
mm,
had, as far as my context, and I do my best not to speak for other people, but as far as my context, we weren't actually trying to solve problems. We weren't actually paying attention to problems. We were just trying to promote the propaganda that had been promoted to us and do it to see who can get the biggest church, who can get the most people, because that's how, I mean, if your whole religion is based on a lack of evidence, then the only evidence you have is how good you're doing and how good people are treating you. That's how you begin to judge your relationship with God. Um, and
mm.
so by that time, I was like, I can't participate. I got into this because I thought this was something that helps people. I got into this because I really was willing to believe that there was a God out there and that maybe snakes talked at one point and I just didn't know enough. And but after at that time I was 28 years old. After 28 years of life, I can't pretend that I haven't known what I haven't known. I can't pretend that there was a voice when there wasn't a voice. I can't pretend that I felt these things that I didn't feel, and I can't pretend that I don't know. I don't understand natural phenomena, which I did. Even when I was in my early, late teens, 18 and 17, that was my apostle days. We would cast out devils and do healing and all that stuff. And I remember telling my partner at the time, he was a prophet. He was a prophet. I was an apostle, and we were tag teamers. And I was telling him, I said, "Your gift seems to be very, very spiritual." And I said, "But mine doesn't." And I said, "I know other people feel spiritual things when I'm exercising my gift, but I said, honestly, man, I'm just paying attention." And I had conversations with people like that along the way because it was very very important to me to be genuine because at the end of the day, my mother's soul was on the line for this. I want somebody who's going to save my mother. And so
Mm.
I wanted to stay as genuine as possible throughout the whole process. And so I was very honest. I'd let people know, like, I'm not hearing a voice that's telling me this. I'm looking, I'm paying attention. And I think, because of course I would rationalize it, I think that's how God uses the gift. And I'd start teaching that's how the apostolic works. The apostolic works this way. It's a very practical gift. And I talk through about how when you pay attention to the apostles in the book of Acts, they're not all doing all these preachy things. They're solving problems and they're addressing problems. They're saying, hey, if we have a prophet that says a famine is coming, then the apostle is coming to get everybody organized to be prepared for the famine. Now you got to jump through a lot of hoops to make all of this work and make sense, but at that time, that's what our whole religion was, is jumping through hoops to make stuff work and make sense.
And could
Uh,
I ask? I think when I uh, dove so fast into the question of marriage, I jumped ahead of your story. Could you take us back to like what were the earliest seeds that made you think, "Huh, there's something wrong here"? Like what was because obviously that the deconversion is obviously kind of the final point, or at least
yes,
the hardest part of the journey. But what were some of the early seeds, and how did you, for lack
I
of a
used
better
to
term, bury them and ignore them? How did you get through the early phases?
I used to keep a journal called a young preacher's journal, and I'd write all of the things that I was experiencing with God, faith, and church. And the biggest things for me, especially in the early days, was just the behavior of people. Um,
Hmm.
because I was naive enough to believe certain things, I believe that other people believe them wholeheartedly too. So there were several incidents throughout my journey that I saw. Of course, just some of the ugliness of people in those early experiences. It I was like, okay, they surely don't know what they're talking about. But the more and more I begin to see that, like, oh, this isn't just restricted to this little church of uneducated preachers, but even the churches where the preachers wear three-piece suits and, have degrees from seminary or divinity school, I find some of these same behaviors, the same pettiness, some of these same things that for me was incongruent with my interpretation of scripture. And the more and more I'd see these things, it became really challenging to say, well, wait a minute, if God is in control, I understand that God is not controlling sinners, but what about his people? If we're all hearing his voice. So that was that was always a point of dissent. It was always a pain point for me going through my entire journey. And I tell people that. That's why I say sometimes when people say you were never a Christian, I take it as a compliment because almost all of the ones that I met, and I can't speak for all of the Christians out there, but almost all of the ones that I met were really, really bad people. And I know they weren't
Hmm.
trying to be, and if I even called the things out that I would consider them bad for, they wouldn't see those things as bad. But I'm like, no, I saw your children suffer. I saw what you put them through. I saw what you put other people through. I saw how you treated people that were different than you. I watched a church assault a gay man who sang on their praise team. He was secretly gay in the closet, but you know, people knew. And so people would take like literally they were throwing water on him and everything. It was just ridiculous. And so
Oh wow.
when when you grow up in church the way that I did, as somewhat of an orphan, where you don't have a mother who's a part of the church with you, you don't have a father who's a part of the church with you, people are really reckless with what they show you about themselves. When they know that there is no one you can really go back and tell and do this and stuff like that there's no one that's going to show up at the church and fight your battles for you, they are really reckless with who they are. And so when people ask me
Hmm.
today, why are you no longer a Christian? I say, because I have a good memory. And so there were a lot of things that I saw that it became difficult to say, okay, now God, you're all powerful, but your people are just like the worst. Almost anytime I'd see somebody treated in ways that I didn't think people treated people, it was at the hands of a believer. But
Hmm.
then there was other things that happened, like meeting people who were not believers and they weren't like devilish. That was so weird. I met an atheist in 10th grade and he never disrespected me for anything that I did. He knew I was a preacher. He knew I was very vocal. But I came over to him one day and I was like, "Hey man, you need to stop smoking them cigarettes. God doesn't like that." And he just very politely says, "Isn't a major part of your community dying from high blood pressure and diabetes?" And that is first like relevance, Your Honor. You know what I'm saying? But it was like, what? Why are you even asking me this question? Well, you're going to tell me that I should be smoking cigarettes because my body is the temple, correct? And I'm like, of course, that's what I'm going to say. And he was like, but your community is literally going through a crisis because of what you put in your temple. Are you preaching that message equivalently or equivocally? And I wasn't. And I never even thought of preaching anything like that. That made no sense to me. But that wasn't the script I was given. I was never told to, tell people not to eat fried chicken. I was said, tell them don't smoke, don't drink, don't sleep around, don't cuss, honor thy father and thy mother. And then so it made me have to take an even it made well, it was moment where I was like, oh, Durante, you might not be doing this with the best intentions, and you might not be doing this with the best information.
Mm.
And so I actually adopted a policy that day that became what I may know to be true today, I may know to be absolutely false tomorrow. And it was just in that simple conversation, and he didn't leave it there. We dialogued for a good minute, back and forth, and it made me go back and look at Paul's writings, and I was like, oh, this doesn't even say the kind of things that I thought it said in the first place. Because Paul does explicitly say in that particular about the temple that there's only one type of sin you can commit against the body, and that's sexual sin, which of course is still like, ugh, but it showed me that I wasn't being as responsible with my theology as I thought I had been, and that I was telling people things that I really needed to take a second glance at. And so things
Mm.
like that, because I was like, well, wait a minute. If it was that easy for him to just have that conversation with me, why aren't other preachers talking about this? Why aren't other, and I was, by this time, I'm getting up there in name. I know a lot of preachers among the assemblies of gods, among the non-denominational. They're, they know me, I know them, but we're all saying the same thing. But this guy just kind of undermined that so easily, and surely we'd be talking about these easy attempts. But then, a little few years later, I was going to a church called Glory to Him Fellowship, and the pastor there was wonderful to me. I loved him. He was a white man out of Chicago, Italian, David Pizzamenti. And he was a healing guy. Benny Hinn came to the church. Rod Parsley came to the church. So
Wow.
he was that type of it was that type of church.
The big guns.
Big guns. And when I say I was charismatic, I was definitely charismatic. And so he died, but right before he died, he was doing a healing. He was doing a healing series. He was doing a series called "The Spirit of the Law of Christ in Life, Death," something like that. But he was doing this series, and he was just walking. And I remember laying his Bible on people, and people would get healed of something with their eyes or something, or just something unverifiable. They would get healed by that, and at that time, I was absolutely amazed. And this man had prophesied over me so many times and said, "The same mantle that's on me is on you." And I'm watching him do these great things, and I had just got an offer to be a minister of music at another church, and they were going to pay me $500 a week. This is, like 2001, so that was big money for me. I was still in high school, and I was like, "Oh my God, God is actually blessing me." And I sat in his service with Pastor David, and I went up to him after service, and I said, "God told me not to leave this church, that God wants me to stay right here with you." And then he died the next week.
Mm.
But that's not what did it for me. It wasn't just that he died. We were a church that preached the theology that God raises the dead. And I told you, my friends
Literally.
laugh at me, literally. Oh,
Oh wow.
yes. We preached it. We pushed it. Um, and my friends laugh at me when I tell them this to this day, because they're like, holy snap, you were a true believer. I really was. I didn't think we were saying things that we didn't believe to be true. I thought if we were saying these things, that we were absolutely convinced that this was true. And so when
Well,
he
it does follow.
died,
If he's the resurrection and the life,
yeah,
and he did raise Lazarus, like and he said, "Greater works than what I have done, you'll do." It's like,
you'll do. And that's what we preached.
mm.
And I was right there preaching it. I believed it. And so when he died, I remember I went in my little prayer closet and I started praying in the spirit, just, waiting to get some type of clarity from God. And then I called the other prayer warriors at the prayer intercessor at the church. And I asked her, I said, okay, so when are we going to pray over his body? And it was like, oh, no, no, they've already taken care of that. And I'm like, well, did anybody try to raise him up? And it was like, well, no. And it was kind of like that, oh, poor thing. You thought that's what was gonna happen. And I'm like, but y'all, this is what we preach. How do you how do you preach this? And then when you have an opportunity to act on it and prove that this is real, you don't even attempt. You didn't even try. So often, I think I told Brady this. It was never the hiddenness of God. For some reason, I could rationalize God not being here. He's on the outside of nature somehow. But I couldn't quite understand why so many people were pretending to believe things that they didn't believe unless there was no basis for the belief altogether. And everybody kind of subconsciously knows that and is just operating this way anyway. And then I started noticing small little phenomenons like church talk, like the word hallelujah. It's a word that has rarely ever been defined. But if you take somebody who's never been to church before and they go to church and they're kind of enjoying the service, all they have to do is hear somebody else say hallelujah. And by the end of that service, they'll be hallelujah and right along, not having any need to have any understanding of the word. And then I really begin to realize that that was most of our relationships with Christianity per se, is that we had engaged with something without even needing the clarification, not needing the understanding. Just what I feel is enough. And I started to feel childish about that. But no, it was definitely different pain points, just marking things along the way that didn't add up and that there weren't really any answers for it. And it wasn't the typical atheist things, such as, the talking snake or the earth not being 6,000 years old. Those things I could rationalize as, well, you just misunderstood what you read. The Bible doesn't actually say the earth is this young. That's what these irresponsible theologians have done with it. So I could do all of that. And I kind of stand by some of that, but so I could rationalize that. But the only proof I have of a God is his people. And that was my understanding, you know. If you're going to tell me that I have to believe something by faith, then you're also telling me that I'm never going to get the evidence. And so the evidence wasn't as important for me as far as for God. But all of these people who claim to be convinced, demonstrating at certain points that they weren't really convinced, was a hard thing to reconcile. And then becoming a pastor and counseling people. Boy, actually sitting in these sessions, actually hearing how people are having to reconcile all types of foolishness to make themselves feel like God did something that didn't actually happen. That became heartbreaking for me. My degree is in sociology. And so it was hard for me watching people breaking, and I'm calling it healing. It was hard for me watching people
Mm.
make decisions that I know were tearing their lives apart. And I'm saying, well, if it's the will of God, let it be. And so I guess the easiest way to say it is, I had given God credit in the beginning. I came to God on credit, but after 28, or not 28 years, but after about 20 years, I had nothing to show for it from God aspect. And the only place I was looking for it from was his people. I wasn't expecting
Mm.
God to do much, because what was clear to me as a child is that God is kind of inactive. And even in my theology, I could figure that out, because God says, there's nothing I do in the earth without a man. And so it was like, okay, anything that God is going to do, he's going to do through his people. But if I can't trust the people of God, and they're where I'm getting my information about God from, then what actually is there for me to trust? Very different experience, but that was definitely me. I'm a people person. I absolutely love people, which is why I'm not angry at any of those people who I saw do very bad things. My heart is broken for them.
Yes.
That you have this type of that you're living under this type of pressure that would even enable you to behave this way to other people and feel justified in it. But the thing is, I know you don't feel justified in it. I know this thing is killing you, and I can't say that, but it was killing me just watching it. I
Mm.
was not a healthy person. One of the little side notes I tell people, when I stopped being a Christian, I was 586 pounds. 586 pounds. When I became an atheist, that was the first time I started making decisions that were actually for my good.
That's
I
almost, I can't believe that's crazy. Can I ask how long were you in ministry between when you would have admitted to yourself, I don't believe, and when you actually left, like you talked about earlier? How long was that process?
Okay, so that would have been around. I started allowing my doubts to. I started entertaining my doubts a little more, between 2010 and 2014. And so I would say for sure by 2010, I was definitely so far out, um, that we didn't do communion at my church. I had stopped doing altar calls at my church by this time. Um, So definitely by 2010, I was already like, I don't know if there is a God, but I still think this is valuable work. And maybe there's just some realm of spirituality that I don't understand. And maybe through that, we'll unpack the mystery of God. So my thing was just keep doing what you're doing. And I did for another 4 years. Um, kept getting up preaching, but I was those last 4 years, I spent a lot more time paying attention, a
Mm,
lot more, having a lot more conversations with people, trying to figure out exactly what my members believed. Um, and it was a very enlightening period. And because of my attachments to church, it was a great season for me because I believed, even still in my naivety, that these people were coming because of God. And what I
mm,
ended up really realizing is they were coming just because they kind of liked the way that I talked. They liked the style of my church. You know, we had blacked out our walls and did stuff like that. Um, but their lives weren't getting incrementally better. They hadn't learned anything significant about God. They hadn't, you know, they 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 would say they felt like they were closer to God, but by this time I'm doing like survey like questions to actually get to some quantitative data and actually see like, no, is there anything really happening here? And so by 2014, there were people who could kind of see it on me that Daranté is not the same. Um, Even my mentor at the time, who's still a big deal in the church world, you know, he reached out to me and he was like, I'm afraid for you."
mm,
And I was like, "Well, why?" And he was like, "You seem to be operating in an audacity that's dangerous."
mm,
And it was because I just been asking other questions, not like my little questions I had when I was younger, like why can't men have long hair? But things like, hey, if we know that Moses didn't split the Red Sea, why are we okay with it still saying that? That's a little disingenuous. I mean, it's nice that we put the little footnote in the Bible and say, oh no, well, this is actually the Sea of Reeds. But to still keep that there, doesn't that seem problematic? That and those type of conversations I was trying to have with my mentor, he was very resistant to any of those types of conversations. They didn't. None of my mentors really wanted to have any scholastic conversations about the Bible or about the historicity of the Bible. And I'll add that in as really kind of one of my stickler points. That was the other thing. None of the preachers that I met and really admired, and people can twist it how they want to, none of them even knew how the Bible came into being. They would reference things in their sermons that made it sound like they knew. So they'd mention Ignatius every now and then. You know, they'd say something here. But then I started to find, particularly in my context, that there was a lot of pseudo intellect in our pulpits because you couldn't engage it in conversation. It could say something from the pulpit, but you weren't going to get a Bible study on that.
mm,
You weren't going to get a conversation about the historicity of canonization. You weren't going to get a conversation about, okay, now how exactly does Jesus become the Messiah from an Old Testament perspective? Because I remember having that problem. Reading Genesis through Malachi doesn't get you a Jesus in Matthew. 1 plus 1 does not equal two. And it was hard for me. And I remember wrestling that at a young age because I'm like, okay, where did God promise to send a son at? Where did I miss this prophecy? Where did I miss this story? And they say, oh, it's right here in Isaiah. But I'm like, you just took one verse out of a whole chapter, out of a whole book, and tried to make it mean something that it doesn't really seem to mean. And I just have to pretend like you have some great revelation about it. And I wasn't that person. I wasn't the person who could pretend that, and again, maybe that was a part of that inculcation of feeling special. I couldn't feel that your revelation was more special than mine. So it had to be based in the text somehow. And if I couldn't see it in the text, it was hard for me to reconcile. And so meeting a
mm,
bunch of pastors and who didn't know anything about their religion felt disingenuous to me, is because one of my things was coming in is that one day I'm going to meet somebody who can answer all the hard questions for me. One day I'm going to meet somebody who's did all the work and just I'm just meeting all the wrong people right now. And of course, that's what a Christian will tell me today. Oh, you just met all the wrong people, and I'd say I've met enough. I'm okay now. These questions are they're not even as important to me anymore. I assure you.
We had
But at
the
that time, yeah,
we had the same dynamic, and very much in my situation where it was just like your questions are number one going to be answered, of course, in glory. So, let God answer them when he's ready in heaven for sure. He may reveal some of them now, but also a lot of this is just a lack of experience. And they would point to the idea of there are people who are much further than beyond you in their spiritual journey and their age, where maybe they're in their 60s and 70s. They've gone through the same questions, but they've come out with their faith stronger than ever.
oh yeah,
Who are you to say you as a 40-year-old know more than this 70-year-old that's really trod the path, the hard path for us? But to say a lot of those people are scholars. They know the Greek, the Hebrew, the Aramaic. They've read the original text and then some. They can spin circles around you in terms of academia. And because they've done the hard work,
yeah,
they know enough to know that their faith is solid. Therefore, you should trust not just that God will reveal it to you, but also in time, but also just look at their example. This is your cloud of witnesses. These are people who have in life gone before you, ahead of you that you can talk to, and you can ask them, "How are you still a Christian?" But the issue is always when you actually ask them for the answers, their answers, pardon me for putting it this bluntly, but their answers suck,
yeah,
and
yeah.
you end up finding out that they're still Christians, not because they've come up with these great answers,
Right.
but because they've simply doubled down in their faith to say, I simply believe. I simply, and you find out that they would have immense losses if they were to walk away from the faith, lose a marriage or a family or a ministry or a job, and you end
Absolutely.
up finding out that they're not smarter than you. Their answers still suck, even though they had 30 more years to think about it. The answers are simply, I have come to acknowledge that some of these answers are beyond us, and God's ways are higher than man's ways. And therefore, I will, like Job, after God reprieved Job,
Come
I
on.
will I will put my hand over my mouth and I will simply repent in dust and ashes and say, God, you're God, you are the King, I am your servant, blessed be your
Perfect.
name. And you end up you get that mentality in you for years at a time. And eventually you don't even care about the questions. In my experience and a lot of my colleagues, I think it's like you almost glory in the fact that there is an ignorance because you're
Yes.
saying to yourself, I don't want to have all the answers. This is not about having facts. This is about having faith. I
Oh
want the
man.
faith of a child. I don't run up to my daddy and say, I love you because I've read all the original languages. I just run up into your lap and say, I can feel your love.
Yep.
And to say, God, I understand that you will reveal the beauties of your majesty and your wisdom. And we used to use a lot that expression or that imagery of a tapestry where like on the one side it's just these loose threads, but when you flip it, it's an actual picture of someone painted with threads or
Yeah.
like a cross stitch. And you get that message of God is doing something amazing in your life, in our community, in our time, in our world, in history. It's a tapestry. And to you, it looks like these random threads, and you flip it, you're going to say, oh my God, you are beautiful. This is amazing. I see now what you've been doing.
Yeah.
My thinking this was all chaos is stupid. God, you are the most brilliant, sovereign Lord of all. And so you end up glorying in that sense of saying, I don't need the answers. I don't even necessarily want them
Yep.
all. I
Yep.
want God. I don't want the answers. I want my king. And I like the person, the lady that broke the alabaster jar on Jesus' feet. I want to be at his feet worshiping. I don't want to
Yes.
be at his feet asking questions. I want to be worshiping this guy, this Lord. But can I ask when it hits you like really hard, that's like, oh snap, this I can't unsee what I've seen. There's too much here that's unraveling. At what point did you say to yourself, I wonder if I'm even going to go anywhere when I die? Like, where did that come into the equation, and how did you deal with that question?
That is a very difficult one for me, right? Because I was never sold on heaven or hell. That was
Really?
and that's one. This may be my first time actually saying that out loud. But I that was a real hard wrestle for me, and it was again because I did try to read the Bible as a contextual critic in some sense, and so because I really wanted to understand it, and I could not find enough scriptures um, to really solidify a theology of hell, nor could I find enough scriptures to solidify a theology of heaven.
Mm.
And these are thoughts from my early years as a child. Heaven didn't seem to be a place that people went, at least from the Old Testament. It was a place that was kind of the domain of the gods, which made sense to me because that's how the Greek heavens were. That's how ancient Asians' heavens were. Only the immortals can live here. Only the gods can live here, which is what made Jesus interesting because now, oh, people can go. Oh, okay, well that's different. That's a deviation.
Well, even if you
But
didn't expect to go to the heaven of heavens, did you expect it to be like a future earthly kingdom that you'd be a part of after the resurrection?
I left that, and this was just a part of me being trying to be genuine. I left that as again to the awesomeness of God. It's just something I'm not going to be able to explain, and something that I wouldn't be able to understand with my mere mortal mind. And I knew it was something that I could stand on scripturally, so I just never it it was a non-factor. And again, I think a major part of what plays a role in that is my upbringing, being very traumatic. I wasn't interested in a God of heaven. I was interested in a God of the earth. That's where all my suffering was at. All of my suffering was on the earth. The afterlife, death had never seemed, and I guess maybe that I'd never become a true Christian in that sense because death was never glorious to me. It was not something that I saw. I didn't see any Christians in a hurry to get there. I've seen a lot of people on, getting sick and be like, "Oh no, God healed me." No, I thought you wanted to go meet the Lord. So, but no, heaven to me, and again, I know this is so weird, but I will admit I was probably a very weird pastor. But heaven to me was something that God was going to have to reveal Himself. I didn't talk to people about it. I did not talk to people about heaven. I did not talk to people about hell. Um, Growing up in those Baptist churches, I remember kids get too close to the pulpit, and the preachers would say stuff like, "Oh, if you get too close, God will strike you down," or if a woman gets in the pulpit, she's going to go to hell. And so I really had just kind of rationalized that these were just the misunderstandings of people, and that we didn't have enough information on those things to responsibly wrestle with it or responsibly try to hold people accountable to them.
Mm.
Again, I come
So the
from a
afterlife was not a big loss to you when you deconverted?
nope, not it was like literally that's why when you asked the question, I was like, oh, like it's not even something I thought about. I didn't feel like, oh, I'm not going to be in heaven. I didn't feel
Mm.
like, oh, I'm not going to be in hell. And a part of that comes from that Pentecostal theology. When I got saved in the Pentecostal church, they preached that you wouldn't remember anyway. That so when you went to heaven, you'd lose all your memories. And so it was like a non point to me. Uh,
I
but
never heard that part of it. It's
right.
interesting though that that's a very divergent perspective. I have heard more the perspective from people saying, "Yes, I expected to go somewhere, but I didn't really like the idea of just worshiping at some like a church service that goes on for 100,000
Oh
years,
yeah. Yeah.
and you take a break for a day and then you go start up again for 100,000 years. Like it just sounded boring as could be. And
Does
it was like
sound
its
boring.
own psychological hell almost to be in heaven, but for a lot of us, and myself included, we absolutely were enraptured with it, and
Hmm.
we
I have a
wanted
lot of
it.
friends that
And
way.
I still, there are days I still struggle with my mortality.
Wow.
I hate it. I did want to live forever, and I know people say, "Oh, you get bored." I don't think so. I don't
Yep.
think so. And I think too, if God is the God enough to make heaven, He can figure out a way to keep me quite entertained, and also He
Yep.
can be
Yep.
timeless and make me somewhat timeless, where if what is actually 100,000 years
Yeah.
feels like it's 3 seconds,
Yeah.
and therefore it's not boring. Like that's and if you were to live 70 years in heaven, you've
Yep.
actually lived the equivalent of 10 trillion years. And it's like the time isn't this a factor for a God that's that brilliant. Like that's
Yep.
not the issue. And heaven sounded wonderful to me. And the
What
loss of it was exponential, and it still is.
What's funny is that you said you wanted to live forever before. I want to live forever now.
Yes.
It's actually now that I realize, oh, it's, well, not saying that it could be a possibility, but there are things that I absolutely thought were impossible when I was a Christian. And that's so funny to me because it's now that I've deconstructed and deconverted that there are things that I thought were impossible that I realized, holy snap, this is kind of possible. And I'm like, I know in the next generation or so, people won't be living to whatever, but we have been getting incrementally a little longer and, things with biotech and all of these things. If I could be a cyborg and live forever, I'm going for it. I'm not, oh my goodness, the world is fascinating to me. And I
Yeah.
feel like I've wasted so much time, on the other, just on that other side, that I want to know as much about it as I can. The fact that we live in this big void or whatever in space, and that only 5% of it is actually accessible to us in any type of way right now is mind blowing to me. And I'm like, I wish we'd be spending more times on solving that problem, because what's out there, and not even just in a scary way, but just like, it is so amazing to be alive and to be here. I don't need anything else. Like, this is it. I know life isn't perfect, but I don't know what perfect is. Perfect is mythology as far as I'm concerned. It is an illusion. But when I look at the data, I see that ever since we've gotten here, no matter how long it's taken us to get here, we've been pointing towards something. The things we can do today, our ancestors would have absolutely thought was witchcraft. Our ancestors would have thought that we were some god beings and that's amazing to me. So, I want to live forever now. And
Yeah,
it's not,
I
and I
hear
feel
you.
like it's kind of a possibility. Maybe not in my lifetime, but maybe one of
I
my kids will bring me back.
I hear you. Well, can I ask just maybe a few final wrap up questions because I want to make sure I get to sort of the end of the story.
Yeah.
When you began to really get to the point where you were sure that you were out, this wasn't like a backsliding, but God now we'll be good again 6 months. It was like, no, this is mythology. I'm done. Once you crossed those levels and you began to, like you talked about, you had to step away from your church and your marriage was dissolving. How did the people interpersonally relate to you that you talk to about this? Where I'm sure you couldn't talk to everybody about it. Some people that are too unsafe to share it with, but the people where you did feel the freedom to actually say, "My life is changing. It's not changing just because I'm changing careers. I don't believe this stuff." How did they treat you? Was there any ostracization or shunning? And if you could also tell us, about the whole, how things evolved in your personal life with your second marriage.
Absolutely. Outside of my current wife, I, for the most part, don't have real family anymore. Which
Mm,
wasn't a, it wasn't, I can't say it was the atheism. That my relationship with my family had always been strange. Um, when I was younger, I thought it was because I thought differently. When I got saved, I thought it was because I was saved. When I started preaching, I thought it was because I was preaching. And when I became an atheist, for a moment, I thought I was because I was an atheist. And then I finally realized, and I love my family, they're just not rational people. That's the best way I can come to it. They didn't like me the whole point, and it was because I have an older cousin. She talks about it all the time that I was 7 years old or something, telling her she needed to get her life right, and she was like 20 years older than me. But I've always been that type of kid. I tell people even to this day, I was a preacher before I was a Christian, and that's something I don't let religion take away from me. I care about people, and I like to use my voice for that, and I have a good one. And so, but yeah, it was you had people who I have family members to this day who still believe that the devil is working on me.
mm,
And I didn't exactly come out and say that I was an atheist when I became an atheist. Instead, I just started making decisions about my life, the things I was doing differently. And it was just those small decisions that started making people or started allowing people to kind of expose themselves a little bit. And there was one particular decision after me and my next wife got together that I had made. I said, we're not going to do Christmas. And it was actually an economic decision. It had nothing to do with religion. It was as people who are kind of coming out of poverty, this isn't a good thing for us to participate in. We need to kind of make better financial decisions. So we'll start there. And of course, I added to it that teaching our kids that somebody else was giving them gifts while we were going out to work hard for the money was probably going to raise people who were going to be entitled. And so probably don't want to teach that lesson. And I shared that on my Facebook page. And this was like 2015. My whole life almost fell apart after that. My wife and I started being harassed by that time, and particularly by her family. My family, I was a non-factor, so they just didn't care. They just talked about me from the other side. But then, at the time, I was still working for a Christian organization, I considered myself as an atheist with a Christian heart for the first 3 years of my atheism, where even though I don't believe in any of this stuff, I'll still participate. I'll still help because churches still feed the homeless, feed the hungry, and they still help clothe the homeless. And I'm all about all of that. And you just help give people some hope. And so I work with the, interestingly enough, Baptist organization, Southern Baptist organization. I was the first Black person to be hired in their district in an executive level position. But once they started figuring out that Daranté had some other thoughts, again, they didn't know I was an atheist, but they put me through something that was the hardest thing that my family has ever had to deal with. Um, they fired me in one of the most ugliest, gross ways possible, and then literally created a whole bunch of charges against me, took me to court. I literally thought I was going to not only lose my livelihood, but my life. Um, it was a small town, Anniston, Alabama, which does have a history with civil rights. Um, but it was things happened that were very bad, and it was really hard to go through. But luckily, everything did work out. The judge apologized to me, and that was one of the most vindicating things that I'd ever experienced in my life. I had to fight the case myself because court-appointed attorneys are horrible. But he wanted me to take a plea deal, and I don't do that. I'm a person of integrity, at least I like to think I am, and so I'm not going to say I did something that I didn't. And so I had to fight the case myself, and my mom did come and support in the case. But I remember the day that the judge apologized to me in court and said, "You should have never been in here. I apologize this happened." My mom stood behind me and said, "Thank you, Jesus." And I remember being so upset at that time
Mm.
that this was Jesus's people who were doing this to me. And I don't have a legal training, but I had to bury my head in case study to figure out how to fight for my own freedom. And you just saw your son, your little baby boy, walk into a court of law and fight his own case and win. And you have the nerve to give my credit away. I was petrified. And so I definitely lost family, but I didn't lose anything that I ever had to begin with. I got into this in the first place because I didn't have family. And so coming out of it, it was a harsh realization of Daranté, you've been trying to ignore the consequences of your life, or not the consequences, but the actual, just the circumstances. That's a better word. Um, and I hadn't been making decisions in my life according to those circumstances. And my whole time as a Christian, I was as poor can be. Uh, I have friends to this day that says, "I didn't know it was that bad." No, it was bad because I wasn't trying to be a crook. I was actually trying to be genuine. I barely even taught on tithes at my church, and I wasn't anti-tithes, but I knew that people were having hard times economically, and so I did my best to be a good Christian. I guess I wasn't good enough, but yeah, I lost family, lost friends,
Mm.
lost my income, um,
It's
i-
heartbreaking.
in the middle of trying to find a new career and trying to figure out, okay, what am I actually good at now? My whole life was preaching and
Mm.
singing, and I had an opportunity to go to a good college and decided not to because I heard the Spirit of the Lord say, "No, I have need of thee." And I had to look back on my own life, and it's funny because I don't count myself as an angry atheist, but I probably am. But I wasn't angry. It was very just I felt relieved from one sense because and this is the best way to say it. I realized I was the problem with my life. That was my relief. God is not the problem. The devil is not the problem. These spiritual forces in this present darkness are not my problem. The prince of the power of the air is not my problem. My life isn't working because I'm not working my life. My life isn't working because I'm not paying attention to the reality of things that I'm experiencing and actually educating myself and evolving my understanding as I go. And so once I
Mm.
realized that oh dang, Durante, fix your life, dude. And God, it felt so good. I started making decisions for myself and trusting myself. And one of the when me and my wife got married now, one of the first things I did, I said, "Hey, You don't have to submit to me. That's weird. That word is weird to me. You're a grown person. You're a whole adult. We're equals. I want a partner, not a child. And so we're going to work together. And if you disagree with me, please tell me. If you think I'm going the wrong direction, don't let me go off a cliff. Um,
Mm.
it's very weird for me to say, well, because Eve did something, you're now less than me. So we don't do that. And I when I told her that I was an atheist, because I was kind of afraid to tell her in the beginning, because when we started dating, it was your former pastor, and her mom was an evangelist, and so it was just like, oh, and then I was like, oh, but I don't want to be that person anymore. I used to tell her, hey, don't introduce me to people. Don't introduce to people to me as a pastor. Don't tell them that, please. Because number one, it just gives a whole bunch of attachments. And if they see me go light up my cigarette, they're going to have a whole bunch of questions. And I don't have time for that.
I
But,
hear you. Can I can I ask? You kind of alluded to this, but could you do a quick comparison of the level of internal peace, emotional, psychological peace that you've had before and after deconversion?
yes, before my deconversion, geez, my life was torturous. And I don't say that to blame anybody else. It was just so much up here. So much up here, and not even just dealing with faith, but just life, period. Feeling like I wasn't measuring up, father, I was a college student, I was full-time pastoring, a husband, leading all these other people, and I never felt like I was good enough. And that was such a weird thing, of constantly feeling like I either had to be perfect and not actually know what anybody's definition of perfect was, because it changed from one person to another. And trying to I lived a life where my whole life was about making other people comfortable. And it created a prison in my mind where I could never say what I felt, never say what I thought, out of fear of offending someone or making someone else uncomfortable. I lived a whole life not even having my own inner dialogue with myself, because I'm afraid that if someone even knows that I'm thinking this, that I'm gonna be in a service with them, and the Lord is gonna show them in a prophetic vision. And then, afterwards, oh man, it was just like again, 586 pounds when I made the decision. And I remember sitting down one day and I said, babe, do you know I don't eat with good reason? And she says, what do you mean? I said, now that I'm realizing of how many decisions I've made without reason, I'm realizing how I've actually lived my life without reason. And I said, I just eat just to eat. There's food there. I'm obviously supposed to eat it. And I begin to use the word savage. I said, it feels kind of savage. I feel like a savage. I'm just being led by my five senses, that I'm not getting an understanding of the world around me. And I'm not a health nut by any long ways, and I don't mean that derogatory to anybody, but I eat what I want to eat. I think I had tacos last night. But I'm no longer overindulgent. I'm no longer sad, because number one, now if something bothers me, I say it. If there's something I don't like, I say it. I communicate it, and it's so good. It used to bother my wife in the beginning, but boy, man, life is so much easier now. And it's just because I've learned how to process, and I've learned that there's no such thing as perfect. I often tell people when I work with people, sometimes you just got to let everything just kind of come out and see what it looks like. Uh, you got to remove those value judgments from yourself and give yourself room to react, give yourself room to respond, give yourself room to be, and then just kind of figure out how you feel about it. And
Mm.
so I've been able to live that way for the past few years, and it's been great. And I'll also say I make more money than I've ever made before. And that's happy, because I was poor. Did I say that I was poor? I was very poor,
Mm.
and it was not fun. It was
Well,
not fun.
it's a great segue to the last question I had, and I wanted to ask you too, if you could, after you answer this one, to add anything else that had on your heart to share before we wrap up. But my last question is, at this point, what's next? And you talked about living a long life. Let's assume you live anywhere between 90 and, hopefully, if the technology evolves, 150 years,
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
live a long life. You've got, hopefully, as we used to say, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. Hopefully, you've got some serious time left in your life,
Yeah.
a time to make a difference. What does that making a difference look like if you were to say, I want to leave this planet better than I found it? What does that mean to you? Just another way to put it, what's the deepest desire of your heart at this point? How are you going to use your time?
Oh, the deepest desire in my heart is that human beings realize their capacity. I feel like my journey with religion, that the biggest thing that I was robbed of is my own personal capacity, actually realizing what I was capable of. And now being on this side of reason and this side of logic and this side of science and this side of wonder and awe, I see that our species is capable of incredible things. And so my deepest desire is that we remove those knowledge gaps, those knowledge gaps, those knowledge traps that we've enabled with our superstitions. So we can finally see ourselves coming into being, coming into fruition. If there's any mark I could leave on this world, if I could just press a button and remove superstition, that's what I do. But until then, I'm gonna do my best to use my platforms and use my work to educate people on people-to-people relationships and educate them on human capacity. And hopefully, by doing so, we get to that place where we no longer need, magic or anything supernatural, because we realize that just as we are already capable of things that are beyond the possibilities that we could have ever imagined. And that's an amazing thing to me. And that's all I want to see. I want to see a world of self-actualized human beings who are waking up every day and just living. And it is deeper than living. Living sounds so shallow when I say it that way, but it's literally living at your most, and I can be a little driven that way. One of my things is that do the work, do your best, do it right, and do the most. I am that type of person. I am kind of hyper productive, and everybody doesn't have to be that way. But I believe if more people knew what they were capable of, they'd get up every morning with just a new fresh fire in them to explore this world. There's so much that we don't know, and that's beautiful to me, because then that means we can find out, we can discover it. We don't Pretending to know only keeps us from knowing, and there's no fun in that. I don't want to pretend to know. I want to actually know things, and I want to be able to do those things with what I know and what I'm learning. And so that's me, man. That's me in a nutshell.
Mm, I love it. I love it. Was there anything else I didn't ask about that you wanted to add before we conclude?
Um, I don't think so. You've been an actually excellent host. You've asked some really thought-provoking questions that really, again, this whole experience has been helping me go back and look at some things. I'm like, oh wow, I was a lot more different than I even thought I was. And but I appreciate that so much, because at the end of the day, even though we're not a part of that anymore, it's still our experience. And so even though we're on this side, we're still unpacking that experience. We're still figuring out just how impacted we were. And so this has been an excellent experience. I cannot thank you enough for having me.
Mm. Well, it's an honor to hear your story. I was just going to make two quick comments. The first one about your story being different or weird. I think for all of us, when you really look back at this thing, I mean, we thought there was a God who wanted to cut off the end of little boys' penises.
Yeah.
We thought there was a God who asks us as Christians to pretend to eat his dead son's flesh and drink his dead son's blood. It's like we were into some weird stuff. We were like, just you were a variation of a theme, but the theme is all
It's
it's
all
it's all
weird.
weird. Like it's just because it wasn't like mainstream atonement theory, doesn't mean it's any less more or less weird. It's just we were all suckered. We were all the suckers in the room, and we
Yep.
realized it. So I hope you don't feel like my questions put you on the spotlight in that sense.
Not
But
at all.
the other thing I was going to say, you mentioned not having family. I think I speak for a lot of us in saying we'd like to be your new family. We hope that as hopefully not just come across us online, but who knows, maybe different trips, different atheist conventions. Who knows what the future holds? But I hope that we can all create a bigger family together as
Yes.
people that have a much more of a shared value system now, and especially knowing not just what we no longer believe, but knowing how hard we had to fight to escape it, how much
Yeah.
we've had to pay for it from the people that are still in it and wanting to ostracize us, unfortunately. But we love the fact that you're part of our community, and I'm so glad too. I just want to say this. I said two things. I'll say three things. I'm so glad that you're willing to speak up. I know not everybody can or should. It might not be the right time yet. I'm glad that when the time was right, you did speak up, because I know you know the story that there's so much to pay for that,
Yes.
and you will get flack, you will get the nasty grams, and I appreciate you being willing to pay the price for that. To hopefully there'll be a trendsetter for other people who are saying, you know what, I've also had concerns, but now that I see his story and his testimony, his journey, maybe it's time for me to be more serious and say, yeah, these questions aren't just the devil. These questions aren't my doubts. These are real legit questions. And maybe I should consider first and foremost, like Daranté did, is this worldview actually true or not? Yeah. And that's great. That's why I did what I did, and why I'm sure you're doing what you're doing, because there are the people that need to see the questions, but need to see the bravery to say it's okay to be upfront. It's okay to be open and honest about this stuff, and to stop shoving this stuff under the table and under the carpet and think it'll work out in the end. It's not going to work out in the end if you don't know what you believe and how it evolved and how it got here. That's what drives so much of what I do, is to say, eventually, hopefully more and more over time, I want to put more and more information out there so that people can say, oh, the church didn't tell me that. The church didn't tell me that. The church didn't tell me that. It's like, why didn't you all tell me this stuff? Where were you? You told me the party line, but I like to think of it as like a table where if like a really big dining room table that could fit, 10, 15 people, and you're going to say, I'm going to put on this table all the reasons you should believe and all the reasons that this is a worldview that makes sense and is true. And then you look on the table and they've like, say it's, food or, pies or cake or something. They've filled it up with like one little teeny pie from the dollar store. And it's like, where's the rest of the food? Where's the other information? The whole table's empty. It's like, well, this is enough. It's like, no, there's a lot more here. And I'm going to find it, whether you will like it or not. Yes. And, that's so critical. So thank you for being willing to be part of the public community in doing this.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to add to that. There was one thing you said that I really hope people heard, and that was just that feeling of understanding that, no, these are legit questions. And I think that's something that people don't feel about themselves, is that your questions are valid. Your questions are valid. You don't have to continue to invalidate your questions. If there's an answer, then you definitely have a valid question. So ask them. That's the greatest freedom I've found on this other side, is just being able to ask questions.
Yeah, and it does take a lot of bravery, especially depending on how high controlling the cult that you were in was. But
yes,
the bravery you're willing to put up is, in my opinion, certainly worth its weight in gold. But I just appreciate everything you've shared and your story. I'll wrap up by saying we've been speaking with Daranté Lamar. Please, again, go like and subscribe to his YouTube channel. Check out his books on Amazon. We look forward to the next books coming out. But Daranté, thanks so much. Great to get to know you.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. Have a great day.
Yes, sir.